The cabin did not return to normal after that exchange. It only grew tighter, like the air itself had started paying attention, and Captain Brooks remained standing in the aisle, waiting for resistance that never came, because Marcus Ellington did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not even shift in his seat. He simply looked at him with a kind of calm that felt out of place at 32,000 feet, the kind of calm that usually belonged to people who had already seen the ending before. Anyone else had read the first page, and that unsettled something in Brooks even if he did not admit it. Last time, he said, slower now, as if stretching the moment would give him back control. Show me the boarding pass, or I will have you moved. And the word moved lingered, carefully chosen, less aggressive on the surface but heavier underneath. While Emily Carter finally spoke, her voice careful but clear. Captain, I already verified his seat. It is confirmed under his name. And for a fraction of a second the authority in the cabin shifted, small but noticeable, like a crack forming in something solid. But Brooks did not turn toward her. He did not acknowledge her at all, because acknowledging her would mean admitting doubt, and doubt was the one thing he could not afford in front of a full cabin of witnesses. Then verify it again, he said flatly, dismissing her without even looking. And a quiet murmur moved through the rows, subtle but present, as more passengers leaned in, not just watching now, but evaluating, deciding, forming silent opinions that no announcement could override. While Marcus finally unlocked his phone, the screen lighting his face for just a moment, and there was no rush in his movements, no sign of someone trying to prove anything, just a quiet sequence of taps, precise, intentional, and Emily noticed it, the way he was not opening his airline app, not pulling up a boarding pass, but doing something else entirely, something that did not belong to a passenger being questioned, and she felt it before she understood it, that something was shifting beyond the aisle, beyond the seats, beyond the narrow definition of this moment. Sir, this is not optional. Brooks continued, his tone sharpening again as if trying to reclaim ground he had already begun to lose. You are delaying service and creating disruption. And the word disruption landed with weight, because in a space like this, that word carried consequences, it justified actions, it made removal sound reasonable. But Marcus looked up again, meeting his eyes, and there was no challenge in it, no anger, just clarity. No, he said quietly. You are. And the sentence did not echo loudly. It did not need to, because the stillness that followed carried it further than volume ever could. And across the aisle the man with the laptop closed it completely now. A woman near the window whispered something to the person beside her, and somewhere behind them a phone camera adjusted its angle, capturing not just a confrontation but a moment that felt like it was building towards something irreversible. And Brooks felt it too, even if he framed it differently in his mind, as defiance, as noncompliance, as something that needed to be handled before it spread, because authority in a confined space survives on control, and control was beginning to slip. Flight attendant, he called out, louder now, signaling toward the front, prepare to relocate this passenger. And that was the line, the one that moved this from tension to action, from words to consequence. And Emily hesitated again, longer this time, because now it was no longer about verification, it was about choice, about whether to follow a command that felt wrong or challenge one that felt final. And in that hesitation, in that brief suspension of motion, Marcus made one more quiet move, lifting the phone slightly, bringing it closer, and speaking just loud enough for the person nearest him to hear. It is time, he said, not to the captain, not to the crew, but into the call that had already connected, and somewhere far beyond the cabin, beyond the aircraft slicing through the sky at 500 miles per hour, a different kind of response had already begun. The shift was not loud, it was not announced, but it was there, settling into the cabin like pressure before a storm, and Captain Brooks felt it in the way conversations stopped pretending to be private, in the way eyes no longer avoided his, and still he pressed forward because backing down in front of a full aircraft was not an option he allowed himself to consider. You heard the instruction, he said, his voice firm, directed now not just at Marcus but at the entire situation unfolding around him, as if control could be reclaimed through volume alone. While Emily stepped closer into the aisle, her movements careful, her expression no longer neutral but conflicted, because something about this moment no longer aligned with procedure, no longer fit inside the clean structure of rules and responses she had been trained to follow. "Sir," she said quietly to Marcus, "if you could just cooperate, we can resolve this quickly." And her tone carried something different from the captain's, not authority but appeal, not command but hesitation. And Marcus turned his head slightly toward her, not dismissing her, not resisting her, but acknowledging her presence in a way that made her feel seen rather than managed. "You already know the truth," he said, just above a whisper. And those 6 words landed heavier than anything said before, because they did not argue, they revealed, and Emily felt it. The realization that this was no longer about verifying a seat, but about something deeper, something she had witnessed before in smaller ways and ignored. And around them the cabin had fully awakened now, the quiet observers turning into silent participants, a man in the row ahead leaning into the aisle just enough to hear better, a woman across the way holding her phone steady, recording without announcing it. Because moments like this did not need permission to be remembered, they demanded it. And Brooks saw it all, the shifting attention, the subtle resistance, the growing awareness, and he misread it as challenge, as something to shut down quickly before it spread. "This is your final notice," he said, each word spaced with intention, as if spacing them out would make them heavier, more official, more absolute. "You will either present valid verification or you will be relocated." And the repetition of the word relocated felt deliberate now, sanitized, stripped of emotion, a word designed to sound reasonable even when it was not. And Marcus did not move, did not reach for a document, did not comply in the way expected. Instead, he held the phone closer, listening, nodding once as if receiving confirmation from a world that did not exist within the narrow aisle of this aircraft. And then he spoke again, not to the captain, not to the crew, but into that same quiet connection. "They have made the call," he said. Calm, precise, and for a brief moment Brooks paused, just a fraction of a second, because something in that phrasing did not fit the script he had been following. It did not sound like resistance. It sounded like conclusion, and conclusions were supposed to come from him, not from a passenger in seat 22B, and Emily noticed it too. The way the captain's posture shifted just slightly, the way certainty flickered before returning stronger, louder, more forceful, because doubt, once felt, demanded to be buried quickly. "That is enough," Brooks said, raising his voice again, turning partially toward the front of the cabin, signaling escalation without naming it. And that was when it happened, subtle, almost easy to miss, but undeniable, a soft chime from the overhead intercom. Not the usual tone for announcements, not the call for service, but something else, something that did not belong to routine. And for the first time since this began, Brooks did not speak immediately. Because in that single unexpected sound, something outside his control had entered the situation, something that did not ask for permission, and Marcus lowered his phone slowly, his expression unchanged, his posture still, as if he had been waiting not for the captain, not for the crew, but for that exact moment to arrive. The chime did not fade into the background like the usual cabin sounds. It lingered, sharp and unfamiliar, cutting through the tension in a way that made even the most distracted passenger look up. And for a brief second the entire aircraft seemed to hold its breath, suspended somewhere over open sky with nowhere to go but forward. And Captain Brooks turned toward the intercom panel near the front, his jaw tightening as if the sound itself had challenged his authority, because this was not part of the sequence he controlled, not part of the script he had been enforcing since he stepped into the aisle. And Emily noticed it immediately, the hesitation, the fraction of a pause that had not existed before, the first visible crack in a presence that had been absolute just moments ago. While Marcus remained exactly where he was, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, not watching the captain anymore, but simply waiting, as if the next move no longer belonged to anyone in the cabin. And then the voice came through, calm, precise, unmistakably external. "Captain Brooks, please contact operations immediately." It said, not loud, not urgent, but firm in a way that did not ask for interpretation, and a ripple moved through the passengers, subtle but undeniable. Because announcements did not interrupt authority unless something larger was at play, something beyond the reach of uniforms and ranks. And Brooks did not respond right away, not because he did not hear it, but because he understood exactly what it meant, that the moment had shifted beyond him, that the control he had been asserting was now being questioned from a level he could not override. And yet he held his ground for 1 second longer, turning back toward Marcus as if reclaiming the narrative was still possible. "We will finish this first," he said, but the words lacked the weight they had carried before. They sounded thinner, stretched, as if they no longer matched the reality forming around him. And Emily took another step forward, her voice quieter now but steadier. "Captain, that is a direct request from operations." And this time he could not ignore it without exposing the very thing he had been trying to hide, the loss of control. And so he exhaled slowly, tension visible in the way his shoulders shifted, before turning fully toward the front of the cabin, reaching for the intercom with a motion that felt less like command and more like compliance. While behind him the atmosphere changed completely. The tension no longer centered on Marcus, but on what was coming next, on what operations meant, on why a simple passenger dispute had escalated into something that reached beyond the aircraft itself. And Marcus finally leaned back slightly into his seat, not in relief, not in victory, but in confirmation, as if the sequence he had initiated was unfolding exactly as expected. And across the aisle the man who had been watching closely leaned toward the person next to him and whispered something that spread quickly from row to row, a quiet question forming in different words but carrying the same meaning. Who is he? And that question moved faster than any announcement, faster than any explanation, because uncertainty has a way of filling space when answers are delayed, and Emily heard it too, felt it settle into the cabin like a second current running beneath everything else. And she looked at Marcus again, really looked this time, not at his clothes or his seat, but at the way he carried the moment, the way he had not once tried to prove himself, yet somehow had shifted the entire dynamic of the flight. And she understood something then, something that made her stand a little straighter, that this was never about a boarding pass, never about a seat assignment. It was about a line that had been crossed long before this flight ever took off. And now that line was being redrawn in real time. Not with noise, not with confrontation, but with something far more controlled, far more final. And as Captain Brooks lifted the receiver to respond to operations, the balance of power in the cabin had already begun to tilt, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, like gravity taking hold of something that had been suspended for just a little too long. Captain Brooks did not return to the aisle immediately after lifting the receiver, and that absence spoke louder than anything he had said before, because the space he left behind was no longer filled with authority, but with uncertainty, and every passenger could feel it settling into the cabin like a quiet shift in altitude, subtle but undeniable, while Emily remained standing near Marcus, no longer trying to persuade him, no longer repeating instructions, just present in a moment that had clearly moved beyond routine. And she glanced toward the front where the captain stood partially out of sight, his voice low, controlled, but different now, no longer projecting confidence outward but responding inward to something he could not ignore. And Marcus sat still, his hands resting calmly, his phone now dark in his palm, his expression unchanged, as if nothing about this surprised him, as if this was not escalation but confirmation. And for a brief second the present blurred with something older, something deeper, because Marcus had been here before, not in this exact cabin, not at 32,000 feet, but in spaces just like this, spaces where judgment arrived before information, where decisions were made before questions were asked. And he remembered a terminal in Atlanta nearly 20 years earlier, standing at a gate in a pressed shirt and polished shoes, holding a valid ticket that someone behind a counter had looked at twice before saying, "This cannot be right." And he remembered the eyes around him then too, the same mix of doubt and distance, the same quiet assumption that he was out of place. And he had not argued then either. He had simply stepped aside, watched the line move without him, and made a decision that day not to raise his voice, but to raise something else entirely, something that could not be dismissed, something that would one day make moments like this impossible to ignore. And now, back in the present, that decision was unfolding in real time, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with precision. And across the aisle a passenger finally spoke, not loudly, not confrontationally, but enough to break the silence. "He has not done anything wrong," the man said, his voice steady, directed more toward the situation than any single person. And that single sentence carried weight, because it did not accuse, It observed, and others felt it. A woman near the window nodding slightly. Another passenger lowering their phone, but not looking away, and Emily heard it all, felt the shift in the cabin, the subtle alignment of attention, and for the first time she did not feel like part of a crew managing a situation. She felt like a witness to something larger, something that was revealing itself layer by layer. And then Captain Brooks stepped back into view, his posture different now, still upright, but no longer rigid, his movements measured, controlled in a new way, and the cabin quieted again, not out of fear but anticipation, because whatever came next no longer belonged to routine procedure, and he stopped in the aisle, looking directly at Marcus. But this time there was something missing from his gaze, something that had been there before and now was not, certainty, and he spoke, slower, more deliberate. Operations needs to confirm a few details, he said, and the phrasing mattered, because it shifted the source of authority away from him, placed it somewhere else, somewhere higher, and Marcus met his eyes calmly, not triumphant, not reactive, just present. And in that exchange the entire cabin understood something without needing it explained, that the moment had already turned, that whatever came next would not be about removing a passenger, but about understanding why he had never been someone to remove in the first place. The cabin no longer felt like a place in motion. It felt like a space suspended, waiting for something unseen to arrive, and Captain Brooks stood in the aisle with a posture that still tried to hold authority, but no longer carried the same weight, because every eye now measured him against something he could not explain, something that had already reached beyond him, and he cleared his throat slightly before speaking again. There has been a request from operations to verify identity, he said, choosing each word carefully, as if precision could restore control. But the shift was already too deep, because verification no longer sounded like a demand placed on Marcus. It sounded like a response triggered by him, and Emily noticed it immediately. The inversion of roles, the quiet reversal that had taken place without a single raised voice, and she stepped closer. Her presence now aligned not with enforcement, but with observation, because something in her training told her that this was no longer a situation to manage, but one to witness accurately, and Marcus remained still, his calm unbroken, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle difference now, not in what he showed, but in what he no longer needed to prove, and he looked at Brooks with the same steady gaze. You already have my identity, he said, and again the words were not confrontational, they were definitive, like a statement that did not require agreement to be true, and Brooks hesitated, just for a moment, because somewhere between the call and this exchange, the narrative had slipped from his grasp, and he could feel it. The way the cabin no longer responded to his tone but to the tension beneath it, and behind him a second chime sounded, softer but more immediate, followed by a voice that did not wait this time. Captain Brooks, this is headquarters. You need to acknowledge immediately. And the use of the word headquarters landed differently. It carried weight that operations did not. It implied oversight, escalation, consequence, and the reaction was instant, not loud, but visible. A ripple of realization passing through the rows as passengers exchanged looks that said the same thing without words. This was bigger than a seat, bigger than a misunderstanding, and Brooks turned sharply toward the front, this time without attempting to delay, because ignoring that call was no longer an option. It was a decision with consequences he could not control, and as he stepped away, the space he left behind shifted again, no longer tense in the same way, but charged with anticipation, because whatever was happening now was unfolding on a level that no one in the cabin had access to, except one person, and Emily looked at Marcus again, this time not as a passenger, but as a point of origin, the center from which this entire sequence had expanded, and she spoke, quietly, almost to herself but just loud enough for him to hear. Who are you? And Marcus did not answer immediately, not because he was avoiding the question, but because the answer was already arriving, not from him, but through the system he had set in motion, and he finally turned his head slightly toward her, his voice calm, grounded. Someone they should have recognized before this, he said, and the phrasing lingered, not arrogant, not emotional, but precise, and across the aisle the man who had spoken earlier leaned back in his seat, shaking his head slightly, not in disbelief but in realization, because the pattern was becoming clear now. The sequence of events no longer random but structured, deliberate, and the tension in the cabin began to transform into something else. Not fear, not confusion, but understanding slowly taking shape. And when Captain Brooks returned moments later, the difference was undeniable, not in his uniform, not in his position, but in the way he carried both, because the authority he had projected at the start of the flight had been replaced by something quieter, something measured, something that no longer led the moment but followed it. And he stopped in the aisle again, facing Marcus. But this time there was no immediate command, no raised voice, only a pause. And in that pause the entire cabin understood that the next words would not come from assumption, but from confirmation already delivered somewhere far above 32,000 feet, in a place where decisions carried weight that could not be ignored. The pause stretched longer than anything that had come before it, and in that silence the entire cabin seemed to lean forward without moving. Every passenger aware that whatever came next would not be a continuation of what had started, but a complete reversal of it. And Captain Brooks stood there with the weight of something he could no longer contain, his eyes no longer scanning for resistance, but settling, for the first time, directly on Marcus, as if seeing him without the filter that had shaped every decision until now. And when he spoke, the change was immediate, unmistakable. "I have been instructed to stand down from this interaction," he said, each word deliberate, controlled, but carrying something new beneath it, not authority, but compliance. And the shift landed across the cabin like a quiet shock, not loud, not explosive, but undeniable, because moments earlier he had been issuing commands, and now he was delivering them. And Marcus did not react, did not lean forward, did not acknowledge it with anything more than a steady gaze, because the moment was not about proving him right. It was about allowing the truth to unfold on its own. And Brooks continued, his voice lower now, almost measured against something internal. "Headquarters has confirmed your identity," he added, and that sentence moved through the rows faster than any announcement, faster than any explanation, because it answered the question that had been forming in every mind without fully explaining it. And Emily felt it immediately. The clarity that replaced confusion, the realization that everything she had sensed but could not name had now been validated from a level that could not be dismissed. And she looked at Marcus again, this time with something different in her expression, not curiosity, not doubt, but recognition, even if she did not yet understand the full scope of it. And across the aisle the man who had spoken earlier leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper but heard clearly by those closest. "I knew it," he said, not with triumph but with quiet certainty, because the pattern had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. And Brooks exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that did not release tension so much as acknowledge it. And for a brief moment he seemed smaller, not physically, but in presence, because the authority he had carried into this interaction no longer belonged to him. And then Marcus finally spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that cut through everything that had been said before. "You questioned my place," he said, his voice even, controlled, "on a flight operated by a company I help run." And the words landed with precision, not exaggerated, not embellished, but exact, and the effect was immediate, a ripple of realization moving through the cabin as pieces connected in real time. The phone call, the interruption from headquarters, the confirmation that had overridden the captain himself, and Emily's breath caught slightly as the full weight of it settled, because this was not just a passenger being validated. This was someone whose influence extended beyond the cabin, beyond the crew, into the very structure that defined the flight itself. And Brooks did not interrupt, did not challenge, because there was nothing left to challenge, only something to acknowledge. And Marcus continued, just enough to complete the thought. "You did not misread a boarding pass," he said. "You misread a person." And the sentence did not echo loudly. It did not need to, because the silence that followed carried it further than any raised voice could have. And in that silence the entire cabin understood that the moment of confrontation had ended, and something else had taken its place, something quieter, more final, a shift that could not be undone by explanation or apology, because it had already revealed what needed to be seen. And as Captain Brooks stood there, no longer leading the moment, but standing within it, the balance of power had fully, unmistakably changed. No one spoke immediately after his words settled into the cabin, because what had just been revealed did not invite reaction. It demanded reflection, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with the realization that every assumption made in the last few minutes had just collapsed under the weight of a single truth, and Captain Brooks remained standing in the aisle, no longer the center of authority but the center of consequence, his posture still upright but stripped of the certainty that had once defined it. And for a moment he looked around the cabin, not as a leader assessing a situation, but as someone aware that every pair of eyes now saw him differently, measured him against what had just been exposed. And then the overhead speaker came alive again, this time without hesitation, without delay. "Captain Brooks, this is headquarters," the voice said, clear, direct, carrying a level of authority that did not need to raise its tone to be understood. "You are to relinquish command to First Officer Reynolds for the remainder of this flight, effective immediately." And the words did not echo loudly. They did not need to, because their impact was immediate, absolute, and visible in the way Brooks's expression shifted, not dramatically, not outwardly, but enough for those watching closely to see that the moment had reached its final turn, and a quiet ripple moved through the passengers, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, a shared understanding passing from row to row that what they had just witnessed was not a misunderstanding being corrected, but a consequence being enforced in real time, and Emily's breath caught slightly as she processed it, because she had never seen anything like this unfold so directly, so publicly. A line drawn and acted upon without delay, without negotiation, and Brooks lowered his gaze for a brief second before lifting it again, not toward Marcus this time, but toward the front of the cabin, as if accepting the instruction required him to shift his focus away from the moment he could no longer control. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, but quieter, stripped of the force it had carried before. "Understood," he said. And with that single word, the authority he had held at the start of the flight officially transferred away from him, not symbolically, but structurally. And Marcus remained seated, unchanged, not reacting to the announcement, not acknowledging the shift with anything more than the same calm presence he had maintained from the beginning. Because this was never about spectacle, it was about correction, and across the aisle the man who had been watching leaned back slowly, exhaling as if releasing tension he had been holding since the first exchange, while a woman a few rows behind lowered her phone, her expression no longer questioning but resolved, and Emily stepped slightly to the side, creating space in the aisle not out of instruction but out of instinct, because the moment no longer required management, it required recognition, and Brooks turned once more, just briefly, his eyes meeting Marcus's for a fraction of a second, and in that glance there was no longer challenge, no longer assumption, only the quiet acknowledgement of a mistake that had already moved beyond apology. And then he stepped away, moving toward the front of the aircraft, not with the same commanding stride he had entered with, but with a measured pace that reflected the weight of what had just occurred. And as he disappeared from view, the cabin did not erupt. It did not break into noise. It remained still, because what had happened did not call for celebration. It called for understanding. And in that stillness, Marcus finally leaned back slightly, his gaze moving briefly across the cabin, not seeking attention, not claiming victory, but recognizing something else entirely, that the moment had not just changed one interaction, it had exposed something larger, something that every person on that flight would carry with them long after the wheels touched the ground. The aircraft continued its steady path through the sky, engines humming with the same constant rhythm, but inside the cabin nothing felt the same, because something invisible had shifted, something that could not be undone or ignored. And the silence that followed Captain Brooks's departure was not uncomfortable. It was reflective, like a space where everyone present was quietly recalibrating what they had just witnessed. And Marcus Ellington remained seated in 22B, exactly where this had all begun, his posture relaxed but composed, his presence no longer questioned but understood. And Emily Carter stood a few steps away, her hands loosely clasped, her role no longer defined by instruction but by awareness. Because this moment had changed something in her, something that went beyond policy and procedure, and she took a slow breath before stepping closer, her voice calm but sincere. "Sir, I want to apologize." she said, not as a rehearsed line, not as a requirement, but as a choice. And Marcus looked up at her, his expression steady, not dismissive, not indulgent, just present. For what? He asked quietly, and the question was not confrontational. It was clarifying, and Emily paused for a second, because the answer mattered. For not stepping in sooner, she said, and that truth landed differently than anything that had come before, because it was not about the captain, not about headquarters, but about responsibility in real time. And Marcus gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, and he looked briefly across the cabin, meeting the eyes of a few passengers who quickly looked away, not out of guilt but out of recognition. Because they had all been part of this moment in some way, some watching, some questioning, some staying silent until it became impossible to do so. And then he spoke, not loudly, not as a speech, but as a statement meant for anyone willing to hear it. It is not about me, he said, his voice even, measured. It is about what happens when someone decides who belongs before they know anything else. And the words moved through the cabin with a quiet force, settling into the space where assumptions had once filled the air, and no one interrupted, no one challenged, because the truth of it did not invite argument. It invited reflection, and a man near the window nodded slowly, almost to himself, while another passenger exhaled, as if releasing something unspoken, and Emily listened carefully, because this was not training, this was understanding being formed in real time, and Marcus continued, just enough to complete the thought. You do not fix that by reacting louder, he said. You fix it by changing what you allow to pass without question. And the sentence lingered, not dramatic, not forced, but clear. And in that clarity the entire moment found its meaning, not in the removal of a captain, not in the intervention from headquarters, but in the exposure of something deeper, something that had existed long before this flight and would exist long after it landed, unless someone chose to see it differently. And Emily nodded slightly, absorbing it, while the cabin slowly began to return to its natural rhythm. Conversations resuming in softer tones, phones lowering, eyes shifting forward again, but the atmosphere remained changed, more aware, more intentional, and Marcus leaned back into his seat, his gaze drifting toward the window where the horizon stretched endlessly, a reminder that movement did not always mean progress, that sometimes it required a moment like this to redirect the path entirely. And as the aircraft carried them forward at 500 miles per hour toward a destination measured in miles and minutes, everyone on board knew that what had just happened would travel much further, carried not by engines or altitude, but by the quiet understanding. That real power did not need to raise its voice. It only needed to reveal the truth at the right moment.